From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here. Our first two guests today are from K-State's Agricultural Research Center at Hays. Vipan Kumar will talk about his laboratory's confirmation of Palmer Amaranth resistance to multiple herbicide applications here in Kansas, including 2,4-D. And he'll tell us about herbicide alternatives, which appear to be effective against this resistant biotype. Also, K-State's Augustine Obour will talk about managing spring-planted dryland cover crops for livestock grazing in the High Plains region. This is covered in a new fact sheet on the topic. And later, K-State's Charlie Lee on the effectiveness of a vaccine protocol for controlling plague in prairie dog colonies. All right here on Agriculture Today.
Did you know every Kansas farmer feeds 128-plus people?
Kansas farmers are hard workers, dependable, authentic, and sensitive.
Not only do farmers put food on your table, but they put clothes on your back and fuel in your car.
For more information about Kansas farmers, visit K-State Research and Extension online or stop by your local Extension office. This message has been brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and as always, we're glad to have you along with us. We're going to share the news with you crop producers about a major discovery that you need to know about. It has to do with a long-standing weed problem in crop production in the Central and High Plains. That is Palmer Amaranth. Our guest now, along with his associates, has discovered that that weed now sports resistance to a very common and widely used herbicide. That would be 2,4-D. Vipan Kumar is a weed scientist with K-State's Agricultural Research Center at Hays. Vipan, thanks for sharing a few moments with us about this. And you and fellow weed scientists out of K-State have been looking at Palmer Amaranth for various reasons for quite a long time, haven't you?
Yes. Thanks, Eric, for having me. Researchers at K-State have been researching Palmer Amaranth been a while now because this weed species has developed resistance, actually multiple resistance to different herbicide mode of action. And it has become one of the major problem weed for Kansas growers. So, a lot of research projects have been focused on this weed species in particular, and herbicide resistance, as you know, is one of those.
The severity of the Palmer Amaranth problem really can't be overstated. It can be quite troublesome in a whole variety of crop scenarios, can't it?
Yes, it is. Historically, Palmer was not a problem weed, especially in western Kansas or in the central part of Kansas like 10, 15 years ago. But over these 10, 15 years, this has kind of become a major problem, and it is present in all crop situations, even in non-crop land situations. Wherever you see a fallow land and Palmer, those seeds, start germinating, and even we have started seeing Palmer in wheat these days, which was not very usual to see.
Well, if we go back to the year 2015, was that the first time that K-State discovered initially resistance to 2,4-D in Palmer Amaranth?
Well, that was my predecessor, Dr. Phil Stallman. He actually got a call from a grower in the south central Kansas, and they were complaining about Palmer Amaranth not getting killed with 2,4-D and other herbicides. So he had done a statewide survey, especially in the western Kansas, and he was the one who collected those seeds in 2015. And he retired in 2016, and I joined K-State in fall 2017. He had some collections already which was suspected with some poor control with 2,4-D. And we started some projects right away when I came on board, and we confirmed last fall that we have a confirmed case of 2,4-D resistance, although farmers already had reported poor control or resistance in Palmer.
Now, that confirmation, was it in an isolated location then, or was it broad geographically?
Well, this paper, what we have recently submitted and got accepted, this is just talk about one biotype we have worked with, but right now we have other biotypes from other locations as well that has been showing a similar kind of response to 2,4-D. So we are suspecting we have multiple population that has developed resistance to 2,4-D, not only from one county, but probably 2-3 different counties.
And compounding the issue further, as you note in your write-up that has now been submitted for publishing, multiple resistance to other herbicide compounds, key compounds. Glyphosate we've known about for a while, but there are other chemicals where Palmer Amaranth is quite resistant to as well.
Yes. It has been previously reported like 2 or 3 different mode of action resistant Palmer Amaranth, mainly ALS inhibitors. If you know, we have used a lot of ALS inhibitors, herbicide like Glean, growers have been using in wheat, and that's not surprising. ALS resistance is pretty common in Palmer Amaranth and Kochia. And other mode of actions we have found in this biotype is HPPD inhibitor, which is Callisto or mesotrione. That herbicide growers have been using quite a bit in corn and some in sorghum as well. So atrazine is another one that has been in use for a while. And what we have seen, these chemistries like HPPD inhibitors or atrazine, these all testing have been done as a post-application. We have not tested this biotype as a pre-applied or soil-applied of those chemistries. So we still don't know if those chemistries are still active or working well if we apply as a pre, but definitely this biotype survived all those post-application with these chemistries. So it is a big concern because these are the chemistries what our Kansas growers are mainly using in our typical 3-year rotation where we have wheat fallow or summer crops. Summer crop could be a corn or sorghum or soybean or even sunflower. So Glean, again, they have been using in wheat. Atrazine they have been using in corn and sorghum. Glyphosate can be fitted into any situation before crop planting or even in a fallow situation. And they have been tank mixing these glyphosate burn down application with 2,4-D and dicamba. So if you see those scenarios and you see what tools we have been using, that's pretty much we have relied on these chemistries, and that we have seen this wheat species have started developing resistance or multiple resistance to these chemistries.
So to stress once again, those tank mixes, and you looked at so many combinations here, they are showing vulnerability and aren't as effective as we would like.
Yes, the second aspect of this paper was to find out those tank mixtures which we can still use to manage these multiple resistant biotypes. And we had tested quite a bit of different tank mixtures, especially based on sharpen-based tank mixtures, things like sharpen with atrazine or sharpen with Sencor or paraquat-based tank mixtures. We had similar kind of mixes there with atrazine, Sencor. And then we had also seen dicamba is still pretty active and effective managing those multiple resistant biotype. So dicamba-based premixes and then glufosinate or Liberty-based tank mixes, they have all shown pretty good control on this multiple resistant biotype. So this is all work have been done in a greenhouse. We are still planning to do some more work under the field situation and see other tank mixes and premixes which have still just got into the market to see our options there.
So the recommendation to growers at this point, use what mixtures will work and turn to the K-State results to have an idea of what might be effective against Palmer Amaranth, plus some other crop management and herbicide stewardship measures are called for here.
Sure. Based on these results, what we have seen so far, and this is, again, one biotype. My program is looking for around 200 population across the state of Kansas. And we have been seeing a lot more population with multiple resistance, especially with glyphosate and atrazine and HPPD inhibitors. There has been increasing concern there. In light of having these multiple resistant biotypes, I would recommend growers to use some of the premixes or tank mixtures which are still effective to take care or to control those biotypes so that they don't get into the seed. Because as you know, one single plant can produce more than 500,000 seed. So reducing those seed production is very, very critical so that we don't have to tackle this problem in the future. Along with the herbicide programs, crop rotation as foundation practice of weed control, try to grow some cover crops if you can in the fallow land. Don't leave a fallow, as such, because these weed species have been getting a lot of herbicide selection pressure in the fallow land. We have been spraying 3 or 4 times in those fallow lands. And that's the weakest link in this whole system where these weed species have been getting developed resistance.
Very well. Once more, this is the first confirmation of 2,4-D resistance in Palmer Amaranth populations in Kansas, and you will undoubtedly continue your research and observations in this area.
Sure. That's just a first confirmation. Actually, it's the first confirmation globally having a Palmer Amaranth with multiple resistance to 5 different herbicide mode of action, and this is the first case for 2,4-D resistance. My idea is to see what is the distribution of these multiple resistant Palmer Amaranth in the state of Kansas, the distribution, frequency, and based on that biological information, what we can do in terms of alternate strategies to help growers so that we can manage this problem in a sustainable manner and a cost-effective manner.
Well, do keep up this highly important work for the benefit of our crop producers in Kansas. And Vipan, thank you for sharing the story right here. We'll touch base with you later on down the line.
Thank you, Eric. Thanks.
Vipan Kumar, weed scientist at K-State's Agricultural Research Center at Hays, reporting on this recent work, which has in fact confirmed the resistance to 2,4-D in Palmer Amaranth in Kansas. We'll be back with more after this. You're listening to Agriculture Today. Agricultural producers, landowners, and creditors, you have a partner in your legal and financial needs. Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services offers reliable, trusted information and guidance. Whether you need advice for ag credit concerns or are transitioning your operation to the next owner, Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services can assist you in making sound decisions for your business. To learn more, call 800-321-3276 or visit us online. You're listening to Agriculture Today, and welcome back. Right here, we'll let you know about a new publication that K-State had a hand in cooperation with Colorado State University and the University of Nebraska. And it addresses cover crop production. Specifically, it looks at managing those spring-planted cover crops for livestock grazing under dryland conditions in the High Plains region. One of those from K-State who contributed to this publication is with us now. He is Augustine Obour, soil scientist for K-State, based at the university's Agricultural Research Center at Hays. We'll talk about some of the things that were brought out in this write-up here, Augustine, but there is this continuing interest in cover crops for livestock grazing, is there not?
Yeah, there is. There's a lot of interest in growing cover crops. Most of the plant species that are used for cover crop are actually good forage crops. So there's a lot of interest in grazing these. How much do you have to graze and when to plant these? These are all sort of things that we are trying to sort out with our research.
Very good. And you, as well as several others from K-State, John Holman, Sandy Johnson, Keith Harmony, all lent a hand putting this together. And it breaks down a number of aspects of cover crops for livestock grazing purposes. It starts with what species to choose to grow as a forage crop. Now, there are a lot of options out there, aren't there?
Yes, there is. There are a lot of options in terms of species selection for cover crops, and fortunately, the Midwest Cover Crop Council has a decision tool online that if you look at our publication, there's a link to that. You can click on that, and it will take you to a link where you can select where you are located in Kansas. And there is an option to select for tools. What are your goals for growing these cover crops, whether you are using them for building soil, you're using them for weed control or for grazing. Then it will give you options of various cover crops that you can grow. And it can also give you information on when to plant this and when to graze this. So we have options. And based on our work, too, we also have some information that if you contact any of us on this publication, we'll be able to help you with the species that you can select in terms of cover crops.
By all means, producers, though, do use that decision tool that the Midwest Cover Crops Council has put together. That'll help you identify what works for your location.
Yep.
However, Augustine, you and colleagues have conducted quite a body of research on cover crop mixtures and what works, what doesn't work as well as far as forage productivity. What are some of the general things you've discovered there?
Well, some of the things that we have seen, specifically if we are looking at spring-planted cover crops, what you need to look at is cool season grasses. Most of them, the small cereal grains will do very well, something like wheat, oat, triticale, barley. And then when we look at the brassicas, something like turnips, rapeseed. And then for legumes, we have field peas or grain peas. And then we have lentils. But what we have seen is the peas, that's okay, but they don't grow a lot of biomass in the western part of the state. So from our work that we've been doing, most of the things that do very well are oat or triticale or barley. The brassicas, turnips, and rapeseed tends to be in there, but they don't contribute that much of a biomass.
One aspect here that's very important, and that is the mixtures that one might go with. And folks have gone with as many as 2, 3, even half a dozen species planted in a given location. You've looked at that very closely as well, have you not?
Yes, we've done this. That is an interesting thing. There's a whole lot of recommendations out there. People are planting as much as 12 species mixes. Oh. And others are planting single species mixes. So it depends on the goal of your cover crop program. If you have a mixture of cover crops, you have different species in it. Each is going to contribute differently to the system. For instance, if you have a legume, it may fix some nitrogen for you. And then there are other brassica species that may have some impact on, in terms of providing something to help with pest control in the soil. But if the overall goal is to produce biomass, then what we have seen is if you plant about 10 species mix, you wind up with about 3 or 4 that will be dominant in your system. So you don't want to be going overboard with this. You want to have it as cheap as you can. So from our research, we have seen that if you have about 3 to 4 species mixes, that would be okay in terms of the biomass that you're going to produce. If you have more of the grain cereal crops in there, if you are interested in having biomass for grazing, then just planting a cereal grain mix will be okay. We've done this on our research and also the on-farm research that we've been doing with producers. We saw that, for instance, we have 8 to 9 species mixes on-farm trial. And then it wound up to be, we have the 2 to 3 cool season grass species, oat, barley, and triticale, that constituted about 70 to 85% of the overall forage production. So the other mixes that were in there did not contribute that much.
So some important things to look at in as far as biomass productivity. What about the forage quality side of it, though? Does one look at this differently when they're thinking about protein content, for instance, and other nutrient content of that cover crop?
Yeah, that is an interesting thing. What we have found is if you grow these species mixes, especially if you have peas in there, then the peas help in terms of crude protein content, and also the forage digestibility also increases when you have the peas in the mixture. But one thing that we also found is even the small grain cereals like oat or triticale, at the time of grazing these cover crops, normally when you plant them, we tend to have them grow about 8 to 6 inches and they start grazing them. So the forage quality is very high at that point. Even all the way up to the time of heading, the forage quality is reasonably good. So if you look at the cost, the seed cost of the pea, if you are not too particular about the protein content, then the oat and triticale mix at that point of growth will still have good protein content. So you don't have to worry too much about that. In terms of the species that we are using, the grasses still tend to have good protein content.
Mm-hmm. And once again, if you use that decision tool, it'll help you sift through all of this. Now, what we're talking about here is growing these forages in dry land conditions, and in the high plains, there can be so much variability. So you've, in this publication, addressed that variability and what producers can do to manage it. You might speak to that for a moment.
Yes. One thing that we found, sometimes you have dry springs and very cold springs. So in those cases, when you plant, it doesn't come up early, and the drought can also affect how much production that you can get from this cover crop. We are seeing huge ranges from as less as 1,000 pounds per acre to as close as 5,000 pounds per acre. So there's a huge variability in this. So when you want to graze this cover crop as part of your system, what we are suggesting is this be a supplemental forage. You shouldn't manage it like a dedicated forage crop. So you have to have in mind that there will be years where you have very less production and years where you have more productivity. So you have to be flexible on how much cattle you are going to put out there. And this publication gives you how you can determine the stocking rate for these cover crops. You can base your stocking rates on the number of days that you're going to graze these cover crops or the number of cattle that you can put on the cover crops.
And the publication does list several examples from various locations in the high plains of Kansas that you can compare to and study what options there, as far as the grazing management goes, would best fit one's situation. Where can one find this fact sheet, Augustine? It's very handy. And
it's very comprehensive. When you go to K-State Research and Extension website, you can find this publication. And if you send an email to any of us, you send an email to me, myself, Augustine Obour, and we have co-authors Sandy Johnson, who is based at Kobe, John Harman in Garden City, and Keith Harmony also in Hayes. If you contact any of us, we will be able to get you a copy of this publication.
Very good. And we've barely scratched the surface of everything that this publication covers in great detail, so it is extra helpful for producers in that respect. Go to the K-State Research and Extension website, and what you're looking for by title, Managing Spring Planted Cover Crops for Livestock Grazing Under Dryland Conditions in the High Plains Region. It's a great resource. Augustine, we appreciate you telling us a bit about what's in it, and looking forward to visiting again about cover crop utilization here in Kansas with you. Until then, many thanks.
Thank you very much, Eric.
He is Augustine Obour, K-State soil scientist based at the Agricultural Research Center at Hayes. We'll be back with more on this Agriculture Today.
Hamburgers, roast, ribs, steak, or whatever you prefer. Beef, it's what's for dinner. Kansas cattle farmers produce 7.5 million head of cattle per year. It takes about 7 tablespoons of peanut butter to get the same amount of protein in 1 serving of lean beef. Support your local Kansas farmers and ranchers. Eat beef. This message was brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, broadcasting from the campus of Kansas State University. Eric Atkinson here, and now to today's agricultural news headlines, courtesy in part of DTN. This week's Kansas Crop Progress and Condition Report from the USDA tells us that our topsoil moisture supplies in the state are ample. 44% surplus, 55% adequate, only 1% short to very short, and our subsoil moisture at 28% surplus, 71% adequate, 1% short to very short. The condition of the winter wheat crop in Kansas this week is called 51% good to excellent, 40% fair, and 9% poor to very poor, according to the USDA. Despite some lobbying last month by the crop insurance industry, the Trump administration's budget proposal for fiscal year 20 again calls for reducing crop insurance premiums, lowering income eligibility, and reducing crop insurance underwriting gains. The budget will also tighten the income eligibility for USDA commodity programs, this part of an array of proposed cuts to the USDA that would top $5.4 billion for fiscal year 2020. While the White House Office of Management and Budget makes an aggressive show of proposed cuts, as is always the case, Congress is unlikely to act on most of the administration's budget proposals. The multiple groups that make up the crop insurance industry trade associations, ranging from reinsurers to agents, expressed disappointment yesterday about the budget proposal, but also noted that the OMB's budget proposal is not expected to receive serious consideration by Congress. USDA Secretary Sonny Perdue defended the White House plan, which would cut the USDA's discretionary budget for fiscal year 20 by $3.6 billion, or roughly 14%. For mandatory programs, the USDA would be looking at another $1.8 billion in cuts for fiscal year 20. Secretary Perdue points to the state of the economy, the $22 trillion national debt, and highlighting the need for belt-tightening with federal spending. He said at the same time, quoting the Secretary, "We will maintain a safety net for farmers, ranchers, and people who need assistance in feeding their families." The White House proposals, if implemented, would reduce USDA spending $61 billion over the next decade by cutting payments, eliminating programs, and increasing or creating fees in other USDA programs. The White House proposes tightening income eligibility for farm programs such as the ARC and PLC programs, lowering the adjusted gross income eligibility from $900,000 down to $500,000. That would reduce payments to those producers by $1.3 billion over the next decade, or an average of nearly $135 million a year. In crop insurance, the main proposal would be to reduce the average premium subsidy for crop insurance from 62% to 48%. The Obama administration made that same request repeatedly. It failed to garner congressional support then. If it were to pass, the White House projects it would save taxpayers an average of $2.2 billion annually over the next decade. And in addition, the proposal is suggesting a cap on crop insurance underwriting gains. That would be a plan that would save taxpayers $2.9 billion over the next decade as well. And they would reduce the crop insurance eligibility by capping, the insurance premium subsidies with more than $500,000 AGI. That would generate an average savings, says the budget proposal, of $64 million a year over the next decade. A quick summary there of the White House budget proposal and the potential impacts on USDA programs, including the crop insurance program. You're listening to Agriculture Today. Now it's on to our weekly feature for dairy producers, Milk Lines, and awaiting with that, K-State dairy specialist Mike Brook. Mike?
Today I'd like to talk with our Kansas dairy farmers about planning for the future. As winter drags on and probably all the taxes are done, maybe it's a good time to sit down and have a heart-to-heart about the future of your dairy and farming operations. One of the things I think is really important for us to consider is what should happen if something happens to you or maybe one of your key employees on the dairy. You know, many of our dairies here in Kansas are held in a sole proprietorship, so the death of a major portion of the ownership or even a serious injury that might take you out of the game for a while does put a lot of pressure on the business. Also puts the pressure on the rest of your family as well. So one of the things that you might want to consider is if you're in a sole proprietor situation, probably need to have a heart-to-heart with your spouse and maybe the other heirs that are involved in the operation. what are the financial plans should something happen? We all don't like to think about that, but it does happen, and it can be very, very difficult for those that are left when something like this happens if there hasn't been significant plans made as to how this will go on. Keep in mind on a dairy farm, the cows continue to be out there, continue to need to be milked and cared for on a daily basis. So how we handle things like bills and the debt structure and the things that just have to be done every day on the dairy are very, very important that we have financial plans laid out that will allow the dairy to continue to operate, or at least some sort of structure in which the dairy can pass on to others so that it might continue on a daily basis. Some things that you need to think about is, even things like milk marketing in the case of a sole proprietorship may change at the death of the sole proprietor. Also, things like dairy inspection and how that looks if it is a sole proprietorship could also change. So, sit down, probably find a very, very good lawyer. You might want to take a look at wills and trust and maybe even your business structure if this operation is going to continue into the next generation. How are you going to bring your children or other business entities along as you back out of the operation? If you are looking for some help on this, you might want to turn to our Ag Econ department here at K-State. In our farm management program, we do have some very excellent folks who have helped many, many families over the years make these turns in the road. So a contact to them would probably be helpful. You can do that through your local county extension agent. They can put you in touch with the people that can maybe help you through this process. I want to warn you that in most cases, this is not a quick and easy thing to do. Many times it can take a year or more from the start of the planning process until you actually have a finished product. And if there's some things you need to do from the legal aspect, now might be a good time to get started on that. This is Mike Brook with K-State Research and Extension.
An important message there, Mike. Many thanks. Our weekly visit with K-State's Charlie Lee is next on Agriculture Today.
While many people know hunger is an issue in developing countries, it is also a problem in our own backyards. In 2010, 1 in 7 Kansans struggled to put adequate food on the table. 2 K-State Research and Extension programs are tackling this problem. The Family Nutrition Program and Expanded Food and Nutrition Education Program reach thousands of Kansans in more than 70 counties. They learn how to eat healthy with a low budget. For more information about these programs, visit ksre.ksu.edu.
We're back now on Agriculture Today, and it's our weekly wildlife segment coming your way once more. Charlie Lee, across the way now, wildlife specialist, K-State Research and Extension. And Charlie, picking back up this week on a topic you introduced last week, and that is the effects of plague on prairie dog populations. And today, mostly talking about a potential remedy for that, but remind us of the challenge that plague has brought to that animal and the prairie ecosystem.
Well, outbreaks of plague, which is a flea-vectored bacterial disease, occurs periodically in prairie dog populations in the western United States. And since many species depend upon prairie dog colonies, including such species as the black-footed ferret, there's a lot of interest in trying to manage plague to enable these prairie dog colonies to survive. Plague typically will kill 90 to 95% of the prairie dogs in an individual colony. Depending on how those colonies are distributed across the landscape, the plague outbreak can take thousands of acres of prairie dogs and reduce them to very few, or it can just simply disappear on its own. There's just not a lot known about prairie dog plague, how that plague spreads across the environment, and how important the fleas are in that spread. Traditionally, the mechanism for plague outbreaks has been fleas biting prairie dogs, and then either prairie dogs transferring those fleas to other prairie dogs by their social nature, or plague-contaminated fleas on other small rodents moving across the colony. So there's a lot of interest in trying to determine what causes these flea distributions and flea populations in such widely varying locations, as we have for prairie dog colonies.
That was the inspiration of a study to that effect, right?
Yes, this study looked at how flea distribution and abundance can lead to these plague outbreaks. It looked at all 4 species of prairie dogs that we have in the United States. It was a pretty extensive study conducted over 4 years. They trapped over 6,500 individual prairie dogs over a 4-year time frame, collected over 20,000 fleas from those prairie dogs, and then examined those fleas to determine whether those fleas were contaminated with Yersinia pestis. The outcome was somewhat surprising in that a majority of the fleas that are on prairie dogs are not contaminated and are not spreading plague. When they looked at the data, only 64 prairie dogs out of about 4,200 different prairie dogs were tested positive. They then tried to determine what factors were associated with the presence of fleas and basically come up with some information that coincides with earlier research that shows that there's a lot of different factors associated with the presence of fleas, but probably environmental concerns, primarily climate, weather conditions, are more important than others.
So this study really did not uncover anything new as far as the role of fleas in plague distribution. It's still a mystery in a lot of ways.
Well, they do know that local weather factors influence flea abundance, and local weather factors then provide the right environmental conditions that are suitable for flea reproduction. But just the presence of larger numbers of fleas doesn't mean it's more likely that plague would be spread. One theory was that the abundance of fleas would be very important, but when you think that through, high numbers of fleas with a high prevalence of plague could lead to a plague outbreak, which would very rapidly decrease the number of prairie dogs. They do know that individual prairie dogs have higher flea loads at some times of the year than others. Part of that is influenced by prairie dog diet, prairie dog grooming. Prairie dogs do a good job of grooming, but I would not have expected that prairie dogs would increase grooming just to reduce the incidence of plague, but they certainly do a good job of grooming to try to reduce the number of fleas on them.
Well, again, one remedy to plague that has been studied and products have been developed to that extent, the use of vaccines. Tell us about these vaccine products and how they are administered.
Well, there's a Sylvatic plague vaccine delivered by baits that expresses the Yersinia pestis antigens, which protects prairie dogs from the plague. And hopefully it can be used as a management tool to try to reduce these losses of prairie dog populations. The baits are distributed by hand, and they've also been distributed by unmanned aerial vehicles. They're putting out about 100 baits for 2.5 acres in various prairie dog colonies throughout the prairie dog range in the United States. The bait uptake for prairie dogs sampled seemed to be about 70%. They determined that uptake by using a biomarker, rhodamine B, which shows a different color, and they were able to determine which prairie dogs in a colony had consumed the bait because of the biomarker. So when you get 70% of a colony accepting the vaccine, perhaps that's going to increase prairie dog survival. It's not yet known that it's how effective that's going to be. It's still early in the research, but we suspect with a plague vaccine that eventually, once we get the bait figured out and acceptance by prairie dogs, that we can start protecting some of those colonies that would build up over time and then be devastated by plague.
But obstacles to be overcome, that's the point here in terms of actually dealing with plague in a sustainable way.
Well, there's going to always be problems concerning prairie dogs and dealing with plague. It's certainly important because it can manifest itself in human populations, although it's easily treated now. But It's a disease that certainly has worldwide importance, and by learning more about how it's spread in prairie dog colonies and the devastation that it can inflict on prairie dog colonies, hopefully we can come up with management decisions that will reduce the devastation that plague can cause.
Well, that's the latest on attempts to rein in plague outbreaks in prairie dog populations. Charlie, thanks for the report. Wildlife Specialist Charlie Lee of K-State Research and Extension. That's our time for today. As always, thanks for tuning in. Eric Atkinson here. This has been Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.